So in the last 20 years, I have talked to hundreds of Kashmiri youth, women, children, old people, except for a small section of Kashmiri Muslim society in Kashmir. People don't talk about the horrors of 1947 Kabali Hamla. And I think this is deliberate. This has been a conscious decision.
And the tribesmen who were sent by Pakistani army with this understanding that anything which was movable belonged to you, which means they looted the state, they raped the women, they abducted the women, sold them in the bazaars of Peshawar and I don't know, Kabul, wherever they did that. And the immovable property, the understanding was that the immovable property, that is the infrastructure, the buildings and the territory itself, would belong to the Pakistani army.
This is a person who, in a sense, reflects the zeal of the recently converted. Though Pakistanis would really never own up to the fact that they're not direct descendants of the Quraysh or something from Riyadh or Makkah, but that's the attitude of the converted peoples of the subcontinent. And it is hard for them to not live up to the legends of Karbala, of the wars that the Prophet Muhammad led against the non-believers in the Arabian Peninsula and so on. And when he talked about the horses and brandishing of swords, etc., it's a very medievalist notion of war that somehow gets absorbed by them into this rhetoric that is really, in some sense, fairly farcical.
Maharaja Hari Singh was projected by Sheikh Abdullah, by his Muslim conference, as this communal ruler who was out there to destroy Muslims, their Islamic identity and their Muslim identity. Now, since Sheikh Abdullah, under the influence of Nehru and under the influence of the leftist Kashmiri Pandits at the time, he converted Muslim conference into national conference.
I just want the people of India to realize that 22nd of October will remain a black day forever for the people of Jammu and Kashmir, for the people of India. And lastly, on a slightly lighter note, we spoke about Dogras and we spoke about the Jamwal dynasty. You must have read the papers last month. There was another Dogra, there was another Jamwal who was giving the Chinese sleepless nights. Ladies and gentlemen, a very, very warm welcome. Today is 22nd of October. It was on this day in 1947 that Pakistani Qabilis or tribal hordes invaded Kashmir. It was today in 1947 that, backed by the Pakistani army, the Pakistani raiders and the Pakistani army let loose an orgy of violence in Kashmir, the likes of which have not been seen in recent times in the whole of Asia. Today, I'm going to introduce this book to all our viewers. This is called Raiders in Kashmir. And this book here has been written by a Pakistani Major General by the name of Akbar Khan. And if you get hold of this book, do read it. It's a fantastic commentary on the perfidy inflicted by Pakistan on the state of Jammu and Kashmir and of course the rest of India. I'd like to introduce the panel to you. We have Professor Bharat Karnad, a very well-known name, sir. A very, very warm welcome to our show. We have Manu Khajuria ji joining us from London. Manu ji, बहुत-बहुत स्वागत आपका, नमस्कार. Thank you for joining us. And Aarti Tikoo Singh, columnist, writer. Thank you very much for joining us. Indeed a pleasure. I start off with asking Professor Bharat Karnad. Sir, this whole thing about Pakistan attacking India using tribal lashkars, this sort of, deniability which Pakistan likes to maintain. They did the same thing in Kargil in 1999. They said it's the Mujahideen, and later on turned out that it was the Sindh regiment and also the Northern Light Infantry, amongst other regular units. Now, Pakistan has been doing it forever and ever. What do you think, in your mind, is what triggers Pakistan to do something like this?
Well, basically the first Kashmir operation 47-48 was really the prototype of all the actions the Pakistan army has thereafter undertaken to liberate Kashmir for its own purposes. Of course, the reason is that, as the Pakistanis see it, J&K, the erstwhile princely kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir, was a majority Muslim state. But the majority Muslim state notion is really restricted just to the Srinagar Valley. It's not there in Ladakh, it's certainly not there in Jammu. So, in any case, in so far as you think of the Srinagar Valley itself, and then you extrapolate to the entire J&K territory, you have a very vast strategic landmass, really. And that is the real purpose, I think, that motivated the Pakistan Army. Because if you recall, the chiefs of Pakistan Army were really very aggressive generals in the Second World War. Frank Messerly, the first CNC Pakistan Army. The second CNC was Douglas Gracie, and so on. So they inculcated, I think, in the Pakistan Army the notion of being aggressive, using covert action to promote their interests. So this is the institutionalization of an attitude that they inherited, which is unlike the Indian Army, actually, which had really fairly nondescript people from the British leftover corps, because William Slim won't accept Nehru's invitation to be the first CNC India, as perhaps you may be aware. It was offered to Field Marshal William Slim, ex-14th Army, to take over Army stewardship. He said no. And so you had on the Indian side an army and a military that was overwhelmed by the pacifistic ideas of the leadership. On the Pakistan side, you had these World War II type generals and so on. And when you say motivation, there was the political motivation of getting Kashmir for the strategic landmass that you would inherit if you had all of J&K. And you had the operational kind of drive that was, in a sense, inculcated with these very aggressive generals and their legacies from Second World War. So I think that is the principal set of reasons why the Pakistani army, from the very beginning, embarked on this very proactive military solution, seeking military solution for acquiring J&K for themselves.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll go to Aarti Tikoo Singh here. And Aarti, before I ask you my question, I'm going to quote certain passages from this book, just to give reference. Now, the first page of this book says, it quotes the Holy Quran, and it says, "And call not dead those who are killed in the way of God, nay, they are living, only ye perceive not." The Holy Quran. And on the first page of this book, the very first page, Akbar Khan, Major General, writes, "It was midnight on the 29th of October 1947, having penetrated into the state at lightning speed, 115 miles in 5 days, they were now just 4 miles from Srinagar, within sight of its twinkling lights. 30 miles behind them was Baramulla, sacked 3 days earlier, where out of 14,000, only 3,000 were said to have survived. In 3 days, they killed 11,000 inhabitants of Baramulla." This is as per Major General Akbar Khan of the Pakistan Army. Now, Aarti, you are a Kashmiri Pandit, and I'm sure you must have heard stories of the massacre that took place. Do they even talk about these things in Kashmir nowadays? Do they even say that, Pakistanis came and they killed with abandon Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, anybody they could find their hands on? Do they even talk about it, or they've conveniently forgotten?
Before I answer your question, Gaurav, I really want to congratulate you for putting this debate together today, because in my entire living memory, I haven't come across anything, any public debate or any official observance of this particular day, because it is significant. At least it was significant in the memory of my grandfather's generation, and even in the memory of my father's generation. I grew up listening to the stories of Kabali raiders. It's become almost like a folklore in Kashmir while I was growing up there. That you would hear stories. If you wanted to scare a child, you would always talk about Kabalis. Kabalis are coming. They're going to do something. So you grew up with that kind of imagination that Kabalis are essentially, they will destroy Kashmir and they will kill us and they will murder us and rape us. And so that's the kind of memory attached to the Kabali Hamla. Now, I've been working in J&K for the last 20 years. I did not, uh, we got displaced in 1990, but I think I was one of the few, and in fact, the first youngest displaced Kashmiri Pandit woman to go back as a journalist to Kashmir. And unfortunately, and I blame the government of India, I blame the policymakers of India for not having done enough to provide this story of our existence, the story of our identity, the history through which that shaped our entire existence in Kashmir, that shaped our destiny in 1990 also. Um, so in the last 20 years, I have talked to hundreds of Kashmiri youth, women, children, old people, except for a small section of Kashmiri Muslim society in Kashmir. People don't talk about the horrors of 1947 Kabali Hamla. And I think this is deliberate. This has been a conscious decision, because if you look at Saeed Ali Shah Gilani, the biggest champion of Pakistan in Kashmir, although he starts his history from 1947, which is he will always quote Nehru, he will always quote plebiscite, the demand of self determination. He will always say that Kashmir did not get the right to self determination as was promised by Nehru. Actually, more than Nehru, it was Lord Mountbatten who, without any authority, promised plebiscite to Kashmir. And depending on, I mean, it's bizarre that he thought that Kashmir was the sole representative of the entire princely state of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh, which Ladakh, of course, is now a separate union territory. So I haven't really, come across people who will talk about the horrors, except for Kashmiri Pandits and except for a small section of Kashmiri Muslim society. I want to make a couple of points here. Before the attack on October 22, we know that Major Brown, who was heading the Gilgit Scouts, of the Gilgit Agency at the time, he had already in June, he had a conversation with the person who was in charge of the Khyber Agency, who had been in Gilgit before, and he had also spoken to his captain who worked under him. And the three of them had discussed plans. I think several books have quoted him, and several books have documented this, that they had discussed the plans, the contingency plans, in case Maharaja Hari Singh would take Jammu and Kashmir to India and make it a part of India. They had discussed contingency plans in June. So June of 1947, and in September there was communication between Brown and his officials, and Brown had made it very clear that Jammu and Kashmir should become part of Pakistan. So there were elaborate plans for which Major Brown had made to make J&K a part of Pakistan, and that is why he was in charge. He, in fact, was proud of leading a coup against Maharaja Hari Singh, whereas the fact is Major Brown was working under Maharaja Hari Singh. He was his
Absolutely.
he was his contracted officer, but the
Yes.
British, had Attlee, for example, made raised no objections whatsoever about this coup that Major Brown led. Lord Mountbatten said nothing about this coup against Maharaja Hari Singh. So
Absolutely, Aarti.
so
Absolutely.
it is astonishing that none of this is talked about or taught in
All right.
schools or colleges or university of Kashmir. Nobody will talk about. Nobody will talk about Maqbul Sherwani, for example.
Yes. Yes.
He was the indigenous Kashmiri, North Kashmiri, who went around on a bike, telling, basically misleading the Kabali raiders and telling them the Indian army was there, which was actually not true.
Not
Indian
true.
army, yeah, Indian army came later, but he wanted to protect his own people, and he also wanted to mislead them and tell them that Indian army is right there. And when eventually they found out, they not only executed him in a public square in Baramulla town, but also they hanged him, they nailed him, they shot him, his body was bullet ridden. And this was after the Kabali raiders raped Christian nuns, for God's sake,
Yes.
in
Absolutely, Aarti.
major church.
Yeah, Aarti, I'm going to have to sort of stop you there and go to Manu Khajuria there. Manu, you know, you're very vocal as far as the Dogras are concerned, and obviously you lead the voice of Dogras. Now, I'm going to ask you, this entire Dogra kingdom, right? Basically, the Jamwal dynasty, it extended up to Tibet. So who can forget the legendary General Zorawar Singh? You see, and it was there all around. So this construct of the entire modern so-called Jammu and Kashmir state, which is now essentially two different union territories, plus much more, which is now under illegal occupation of Pakistan. This was all Dogra Raj. This was controlled by the Dogras. Now, after independence of India and after the instrument of accession was signed by Maharaja Hari Singh and J&K officially became part of India. Now, how do the Dogras remember 22nd of October? How do they remember it? They were the rulers, and today suddenly in till last year, 5th of August, Dogras had no say in Kashmir at all. I've seen this great groundswell of anger in Jammu. Whenever I've gone to Jammu, I've seen people are extremely upset, extremely angry, and they say that this entire Gupkar gang has hijacked everything, etc., etc. You know what it is like in the valley, right? So, how's it? What is the Dogra narrative around 22nd of October?
Well, first of all, thank you, Major Arya, for getting me on this show, because I think that missing Dogra narrative is what you are, by just me being here, it gets sort of answered, or it gets due space. And when we talk about October 22nd, I think for anyone who is from Jammu and Kashmir, October is a very somber month, because there were these events which were so macabre, which were so gory, which were so bloody, which led up to the 26th of October, that everybody from Jammu and Kashmir feels a sense of heaviness. So now let me tell you about the Dogra perspective on this. I mean, there are going to be lots of webinars. I am involved in a lot of webinars till the 26th of October. And what has been the Dogra angst is that the role of the Dogra state forces, the role of Maharaja Hari Singh, the massacres, the absolute genocide in Mirpur, Muzaffarabad sector is never talked about. It's not discussed at all. It's very important to remember that it was on the October of 27th when the Indian Army under Colonel Ranjit Rai landed in Srinagar. But before that, what was happening? And why it's also important for entire India, I would say, why this history needs to be revisited is that the same narrative that Pakistan peddled in October 1947, it's continuing to peddle now, which is that in October 1947, they were rushing to help their Muslim brothers in the valley against a genocidal Hindu ruler. And now they are aiding the separatists or the terrorists, sending terrorists in the valley because they are protecting them from a genocidal Hindu state. It's the same narrative from October 1947 to October 2020, and hence it must be revisited, because the first question is that was the Hindu Maharaja or the Hindu Dogra rule, was it communal? It wasn't, because 101 years of Dogra rule and there was no conversion, no demographic change, no exodus. The Hindus remained a minority in Jammu and Kashmir while under the rule of, these Dogra Jamwal dynasts. Secondly, till September 1947, there was no communal riot in Jammu and Kashmir. I mean, Gandhiji came and said it's like a paradise, and he was not referring to the natural beauty of Kashmir. He was referring to the fact that there was no communal incident, whereas the rest of India was burning in communal riots. So that shows in itself that there was a stray incident in September 1946 in Jammu town, which was immediately squashed. A Hindu youth was killed. It was followed by 3 Muslim youth being killed, and then it was squashed. And before that, maybe 1931, which was again a British conspiracy, but it was a largely peaceful state. Nothing was happening. And here, I think if you read more books, you've shown a very important read for us, which is the book by Major Akbar Khan. But other books by POJKians themselves from Mirpur will tell you that they also understand that there was this understanding between the Pakistani army and the tribal raiders, the Afridis and the Waziris, that you go and you loot Jammu and Kashmir. And this was a very, very, it was a long belt from Sinkiang to Madhopur. And the resources were thin because Maharaja Hari Singh had sent his mountain batteries to the World War II. I mean, he was forced to send his mountain batteries there. So you had the infantry without any artillery, so to speak. So you had this entire belt, and the tribesmen who were sent by Pakistani army with this understanding that anything which was movable belonged to you, which means they looted the state, they raped the women, they abducted the women, sold them in the bazaars of Peshawar and, I don't know, Kabul, wherever they did that. And the immovable property, the understanding was that the immovable property, that is the infrastructure, the buildings and the territory itself, would belong to the Pakistani army. I mean, it's a known fact now that it was in August 20th, the Operation Gulmarg was, known, and people were being warned. Jammu and Kashmir, Maharaja Hari Singh knew about it. But of course, it was so hard to protect this entire border. And if you look at the reports by the political agent, W.F. Webb and General Scott, it's very clear that it was peaceful. And Dogra state forces had done a commendable job, not only protecting the population, but also protecting the 250,000 refugees who had started pouring into Jammu and Kashmir since December 1946, from as far as Hazara. They had started pouring in. So it clearly shows that the Pakistani narrative that, they were coming to, somehow there was this homegrown call for come help me from this Hindu genocidal ruler, is completely false. And the fact remains that the Dogra state forces, which were like around 8,000, 3,000 of them were Muslim. So if there was this Maharaja Hari Singh who was out to do an ethnic cleansing of the Muslims, he would have had to start with his own forces. And it's the other way around. The best battalion, the 4th Jack, was protecting the borders, and they were the ones who were betrayed by the Muslim companies, the 2 Muslim companies of 4th Jack. There were 2 Hindu companies of 4th Jack, and there were 2 Muslim companies of 4th Jack. And Lieutenant Colonel Narayan Singh was leading this. And time and again, Maharaja Hari Singh asked him that, do you want the Muslim companies to be replaced? And this is probably an ode to his military values, his values as a soldier. He said, I trust my men. I have fought with them in the trenches in World War II. I fought against the Japanese. My battalion has won like 5 military awards. I trust my Muslim company. And unfortunately, on the night of 21st October, he was betrayed, killed in his sleep. And the Muslim company led the tribal raiders into these positions in Domail and Muzaffarabad. And then finally, the military staff. It's important again for me to especially point out that when Maharaja Hari Singh heard this, he called the Chief of Military Staff, Brigadier Rajinder Singh, who was a Dogra from Samba, and he said that you quickly, collect some men, and I am going to lead them. I'm going to go to Uri, which was a very, very shocking declaration. And immediately Brigadier Rajinder Singh said, no, I'm going to go and lead the men. And he, with 100 men, went to, he proceeded to Uri, and he held off probably 5,000 to 6,000 tribal raiders for 4 days. And if Srinagar had fallen, if not for Brigadier Rajinder Singh, the instrument of accession wouldn't have been signed. This place, this due place or recognition of what Fort Jack did, what the Dogra state forces did, how Maharaja Hari Singh was not communal, how this was not an homegrown call for azadi, how this was a deal between the Pakistani army, which had every 1,000 tribal raiders were led by one major, one captain, and 10 JCOs. Yes, 10 JCOs. This is a completely a narrative which needs to be pushed out, because this is continuing in Jammu and Kashmir. And Dogra state forces and their role must be highlighted and must be celebrated.
Absolutely. Thank you, Manuji, for your comments. I'll go to Professor Bharat Karnad once again. Sir, recently Shahid Afridi, the Pakistani cricketer, gave an interview in which he said that he's very proud of the fact that his own grandfather came to Kashmir and he fought in Kashmir in 1947.
बात करता हूं, कश्मीर की बात इसलिए करता हूं क्योंकि मेरे खून में है और खून में क्यों है? क्योंकि आजाद कश्मीर के बड़ों ने मेरे दादा को, अब्दुल बागी साहब पीर और पुटान शरीफ को 1949 में गाजी कश्मीर का लक़ब दिया है। तो इसलिए मैं कश्मीर के साथ हूं।
I'm just trying to sort of grab hold of the psychology behind all this, and that is my intent. The psychology that his grandfather, he's proud of the fact that his own grandfather, in any other decent family, the grandfather would have been disowned, but apparently in the Afridi family, such people are lionized. He came to Kashmir, he killed, he raped, he pillaged, and he got a medal for his sins. And he's a hero in the Afridi household and the neighborhood. Now, if I were to talk to you about how they name their missiles, it's Ghaznavi and Gauri. So there is a certain mindset also at play here. I'd like you to take us through this, please, especially with the backdrop of 22nd of October. This whole thing that, we will come from the mountains on our horses wielding swords, and we are going to chop off the head of the infidels and everything will collapse around us and we'll be the victors. And, sir, before I proceed, I'd also like to quote, before I sort of hand it over to you, there's something that I'd like to quote to you from this book. On page 67, it says, 2 days later, when the Indians still appeared to be threatening Chakoti, at least some 350 Pakistani volunteers arrived. They were mostly ex-servicemen armed with rifles and promising to look at. The danger at least appeared to be at an end, but that was not so. These new arrival, though mostly ex-servicemen, showed a heart-breaking reluctance to get within hitting range of the enemy. During the following days, one task after another entrusted to them was abandoned after they were fired at several times. The old handful under Major Aslam were again left alone on the hills. So you come with a great deal of preparation. You say that we are the descendants of Gauri and Ghaznavi, and then you get hammered. This has been history, tradition. In the Pakistani army, they say, Iman, Taqwa, Jihad, fi sabilillah. Now, it's not happening, sir.
I'm reminded of a conference that was there in December 1982, before you young ladies were perhaps born. This was the first conference on peace and security, international conference on peace and security in South Asia, very grandly titled, hosted by the Pakistan Army, actually. And the three of us from India were invited. K. Subramaniam in the Gujarat first, K. Subramaniam and myself. I was a smart alecky type, in jeans and so on, while the other two were buttoned up. Now, the thing that Subramaniam said, that was very, and that, by the way, had the largest audience. People were hanging from the rafters, wanting to listen to K. Subramaniam. Now, I was sitting next to a Major General of the Pakistan Army. Before Subbu started, he said, ye Tamil Brahmin hai na, ye ullu banane wala hamara. So the point that Subbu made was that the so-called martial races that are supposed to populate this entire belt going up to Afghanistan, they said, and he said it very mockingly to the Pakistani audience, and they were pretty much, cowed down by his very aggressive demeanor. And he said, for martial races, it's incredible that anytime there were the Afghan invaders trying to pass through their land to loot and pillage Delhi, because there's nothing in that part of the world that really attracted them. It was Delhi and the Gangetic Plains, the wealth here that they were seeking. And all they did was, he said, Ji Huzur, and then just parted ways and let them in. He said, this is the history of the Marshall Range. So I don't think we should take Mr. Afridi very seriously. This guy is a chap who told the pressman, I believe it was a pace bowler, he said that I have very fiery balls. Now, I mean, this is a person who, in a sense, reflects the zeal of the recently converted. Most of, though Pakistanis would really never own up to the fact that they're not direct descendants of the Quraysh or something from Riyadh or Makkah, but that's the attitude of the converted peoples of the subcontinent. And it is hard for them to not live up to the legends of Karbala, of the wars that Prophet Muhammad led against the non-believers in the Arabian Peninsula and so on. And when he talked about the horses and brandishing of swords, etc., it's a very medievalist notion of war that somehow gets absorbed by them into this rhetoric that is really, in some sense, fairly farcical. Now, as to the people, in a sense, being very admiring of whatever Shahid Afridi's grandfather did or whatever, they have to hang on to something, for God's sake. Even if it is pillaging and looting unarmed people, what else did they do in that 48 ops? These raiders, led by the Pakistan Army stalwarts, let's be very clear, and INA stalwarts, Indian National Army, which is really the more tragic aspect as I see it. These are the people who, yes, they were picked from the prisoners of war camp in, Singapore, etc. The fact that they still came under the, flag of Netaji and so on, that for these people to turn around and join the Kabeli, the tribal riffraff that the Pakistan Army and the Britishers had helped put together. Let's not forget the Britishers, because I think it is remarkable that Messavi should have said that, and he said it post facto, after the 47 thing was done by Akbar Khan, he said that you could do it with 4 or 5 companies. Why did you have to go through letting loose the Kabelis, who are undisciplined lot? I would put one company in Banihal, I would put another somewhere, and you could have taken, and he said, of course, the Srinagar airfield, and you'd have taken all of Kashmir. Why did you have to? This is Messavi talking. So if you refer back to what I said, that this is a very aggressive general saying what would have been a better military tactic, rather than letting loose these idiots to go out there if your objective was to capture the territory of J&K. And just a little other thing to pick up on, I think, what Aarti said. Major Brown, when he annexed Gilgit and Hunza Gilgit and Baltistan, and certainly Hunza Gilgit, so Baltistan came as part of the package with the garrison he was commanding. He did so, if you look at the timeline, after Lord Wavell, who was then the Viceroy and then formerly C&C Middle East Command, who was kicked upstairs by Churchill or whatever it was and brought in as Viceroy India, who actually, gave substance to the notion of Pakistan as a state that Britain would continue to control, because they were sure that Nehru would not be amenable to any such idea of the British still having residual, control and command over the Indian military or anything else that they would have. They knew they had no purchase. They would have no purchase in India, but they would be able to have in a Pakistan that was controlled by the army. So all this becomes far more intermeshed and, in a sense, comprehensible. You see all the various strands. If you bring them together, and at this late date with so much evidence available from all sources, the tapestry is complete. And this is what comes out, that this is a British and it's the perfidious Albion, ultimately, whom no one trusted. And the British did the mischief, and they were at the root of the mischief. So let's be very clear of who the mischief mongers were. You know, you can blame Akbar Khan, you can blame a whole bunch of people, and thank God Akbar Khan and the Pakistan army didn't have the strategic wit that Messavi, in fact, said they ought to have had to exercise this kind of operation. So, but British are at the core of the problem that they created to serve their own strategic purpose, and the rest, of course, is history.
Thank you very much, sir. Aarti, thinking about what Professor Bharat Karnad said, now I'd like to ask you, there is this entire narrative in Kashmir which is dying and on its last legs. But yes, for a very long time, there was this narrative that among some people, not all, a few people, especially the Hurriyat Conference and their affiliates in the valley, that Pakistan will come and help. You see, Pakistan will come. Pakistan has never helped. It is looted, yes, raped, yes. And even when I was in JNK in the 90s, when I was in the army, we used to have these Afghans and these Pakistani tribals coming in across the line of control. Now, obviously, now it's fenced properly. During our time, there was no fence. And they used to come and they did exactly the same thing to the locals that their forefathers had done in 1947 after 22nd of October. Now, my question to you, Aarti, is that, where does this kind of hope come from? What is this kind of propaganda that these people over a period of time, the Hurriyat Conference, etc., and their affiliates have spread amongst the Kashmiris that Pakistanis will come and help? Pakistanis have always only looted and raped.
Yeah. A couple of points I want to mention. I want to add on to what Professor Karnad said before I get to your question. The British, of course, were the culprits. And the reason for that, of course, was the Great Game. They were sure that Nehru would not be favorable to the idea of using Gilgit-Baltistan as an agency to check Russia, to the Soviet Union at the time. So that is one. And the second point, to answer your question, that where does this come from? Where does this whole idea that Pakistan is going to come and help, despite the fact that Pakistan has been looting, plundering, pillaging, and destroying Kashmiri Muslims since 1947? Well, I have to say that one, do not forget the history of Jammu and Kashmir Muslim Conference, which was the parent body of National Conference, which Sheikh Abdullah set up. And if you remember history, you would know that Sheikh Abdullah led a movement against Maharaja Hari Singh, the Dogra rule in J&K. And many, I think it will be difficult to establish whether Sheikh Abdullah was really an agent of the British or not. But there have been insinuations that he did, in fact, execute the British plan in a way, because the British forced Maharaja Hari Singh, for example, to set up Glancy Commission, which made several recommendations and which essentially communalized the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir, which Manu was also referring to earlier, that Maharaja Hari Singh was projected by Sheikh Abdullah, by his Muslim conference, as this communal ruler who was out there to destroy Muslims, their Islamic identity and their Muslim identity. Now, since Sheikh Abdullah, under the influence of Nehru and under the influence of the leftist Kashmiri Pandits at the time, he converted Muslim Conference into National Conference. But a section of the Kashmiri Muslim Society remained with that Muslim Conference. They eventually, grew slowly with the help of Jamaat-e-Islami, for example, which is Jamaat-e-Islami Kashmir is affiliated with Jamaat-e-Islami Pakistan. and Jamaat-e-Islami Pakistan is essentially and Jammu and Kashmir. They are essentially the religious political wing of Hizbul Mujahideen terror group, which is banned. It's a banned terror outfit across the world right now. So that, those people who were part of the Muslim conference, Jamaat-e-Islami, over time, even in 1965 war between India and Pakistan, Kashmiri Muslims were not in support of the idea of Pakistan. In 1947, going back to Professor Karnad's point, that Major Akbar Khan and Liaquat Ali Khan, they did not have the strategic sense. I think they may not have the strategic sense, but they had the tactical sense, because they knew that Kashmir in 1947 was not in favor of Pakistan. Sheikh Abdullah, who was the leader of Kashmiri Muslim Society, by 1947 was seen as a leader of both Hindus and Muslims in Kashmir. Because he had set up National Conference, and National Conference had attained this secular characteristic under which it was seen as speaking for everybody. So Pakistan did have the tactical sense to stop where it stopped in 1947, but the Muslim conference worked really hard. Pakistan, ISI worked really hard to infiltrate people, to buy people in Kashmir, to slowly strengthen and deepen the communal divide, and also strengthen the Muslim conference constituency in Kashmir with the help of Jamaat-e-Islami. That is why that this notion that Pakistan will come and help, because after all we are the same, with the same people religiously. Jammu and Kashmir, a Muslim majority state, should have gone to Pakistan because we are supposed to be part of the Muslim Ummah, the whole idea of Caliphate, the whole idea of Muslim brotherhood.
Absolutely.
So essentially, Kashmir problem, as we know it today, in 1990 and in 1947, has been a project of Islamic Jihad. In fact, Aisha Jalal, she wrote a book, not the sole spokesperson, which is on Jinnah, but a later book, I think Fighters of Allah or something, in which she actually, goes deep into the movement, which they call the revivalist movement of Islam in South Asia, under which Jamaat-e-Islami strand emerged, Deoband emerged, and many other jihadi strands of Islam emerged, and mixed politics with, of course, with religion, and basically came up with the idea that Islam needs a state, which is essentially Islamic State. That Islam and Muslims, they cannot be ruled by anybody else. Hence the concept of two-nation theory. Hence the concept that Hindus and Muslims cannot coexist. Hence the idea that Pakistan, a state for Muslims. So this is the thinking that has gone deep into Kashmiri Muslim society, and it happened because of Muslim conference. It happened because of Jamaat-e-Islami and Deoband, which later came into the picture.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aarti. You spoke about political Islam very eloquently, and it's also about, I think, to my mind, about Islam having a geographical identity as well, not just a spiritual or religious identity. I'll end this webinar with final comments from Manu Khajuria ji. Manu ji, spoke about a state here and having your own identity state. Very recently, there was a demand by people from Jammu saying that Jammu should be separate from Kashmir, because obviously it's very well known and documented that the Dogras have got the wrong end of the stick since 1947. They are the people who created Jammu and Kashmir state, erstwhile state as we know it. But now they've been almost, if I may use the word, second-class citizens. This entire thing about Jammu being a separate state, how do you feel about it? What do you feel? Do you think it's going to sort of heal the wounds of the past? Because there are very deep wounds in Jammu. I've been there many times, and it's the wounds are very deep in Jammu.
Yes, Mijari, I think that's how Voice of Dogras came about, because the angst was such and it was not getting a proper direction. Nobody was listening to us. We felt invisible. And somehow there was this need, and thank God for social media, that we found a platform to just, tell our stories and talk about these things. I mean, Aarti shared, like just going back to 1947, Aarti shared about the fear of Kabylis. My village, which is very close to the international border, was completely razed to the ground. My grandfather, who was a Patwari at that time, in fact, he got to know that what was happening. The villages around on the border were being armed. So he sort of told his village that we need to leave. So thankfully, the village had left, and that's when it was like razed to the ground. So these things we have seen, and as a Dogra, it's very hard, because we are so secular by nature. I don't identify myself as, or Dogras don't see themselves as a Dogra Hindu or a Dogra Muslim. We've never ever used this terminology. So now we are having to, because as Aarti had said, that when you communalize, when you discriminate based on religion, then you have suddenly you realize that you're different. There is a Dogra Musalman and there is a Dogra Hindu and there is a Kashmiri Muslim. This has been a long process, and it's been recent in the sense that it's been 7 decades long. So it's the Abdullahs who brought it in. It's the various separatist organizations that have brought it in. And this is a new thing for us. And really, Jammu is tired of saying that, listen to us as well. We also exist. We are not, the J is not silent in Jammu and Kashmir. And though it really hurts me to think of even the bifurcation was hard for me, because it was General Zorawar Singh who died in Tibet, and it was the Dogra men, it was the Dogra state forces who went and who, they sacrificed, they made the supreme sacrifice. They demarcated these boundaries. They stretched the boundaries of India to the northwest frontiers. It's very, very hard for me or any of the elders that I speak to see the breakup. I mean, today is Maharaja Gulab Singh's 228th birth anniversary. He's the one who created the state. And to see it break away is very hard. But then we have been pushed to a corner. I mean, jobs are being promised to people who will, to terrorists, and Jammu youth is jobless and voiceless. And you see the NEET topper, current topper is from Jammu, but we have the Lieutenant Governor congratulating a Kashmiri youth who deserves congratulations, but he's not the topper. But it's been advertised like that. So somebody who's wearing an Azad Jammu Kashmir flag is being, is on the government website, and he's being given cricket kits, and then you have a youth somewhere in Kishtwar and Bhadarwa who is equally fighting terrorism, who has not left his village or his town, and is like, listen to me, I have something to say. So I think, yes, I'm seeing a louder demand for Jammu statehood, only because we've not been given our due place, we've not been given our rights.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Bharat Karnad. Thank you, Aarti Tikoo Singh, and thank you, Manu Khajuria ji, for the lovely webinar. I'll sort of close it here. I just want the people of India to realize that 22nd of October will remain a black day forever for the people of Jammu and Kashmir, for the people of India. And lastly, on a slightly lighter note, we spoke about Dogras and we spoke about the Jamwal dynasty. You must have read the papers last month. There was another Dogra, there was another Jamwal who was giving the Chinese sleepless nights. And with that, I end this webinar. Thank you very much. Jai Hind, and a pleasure speaking to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.